right now we're switching over to the Supreme Court. Please challenging the demonetization policy of 2016 of the central government as we speak before the Supreme Court. Remember, the Supreme Court is going to pronounce its verdict on the pleas against the note ban shortly. The Apex Court had taken up a batch of 58 petitions, you remember, challenging various aspects of the government's note ban decision. My colleague Pallavi Ghosh with us this morning to bring us context on this entire story. Pallavi, as we know, senior advocate P. Chidambaram, also Congress leader, he has been fighting this case. One of the pleas, and it's in the last few days when the pleas have been taken a look at by the Supreme Court. Some of the questions that have been looked at by the Supreme Court are A, did this demonetization originate from the government or from the RBI? B, whether or not proper reasoning was provided. Can you tell us more about what the Supreme Court took a look at and what these judgments will mean?
So basically, the objection to the demonetization, and that was something as put forward of Mr. Chidambaram, who's of course been a finance minister. He's himself a senior advocate, apart from being a member of the Congress party. And all of those who have been opposing demonetization have labeled it as a hurriedly taken decision, which did not help the economy, in which the RBI was also possibly not kept in the loop. That was the main petition which is there before the Supreme Court, and the hearing is being put out. And my colleague Ananya Bhatnagar, of course, is giving out all those details. But I think the key point which is coming out first from the Supreme Court is the fact that RBI, we have emphasized in the primary role of RBI to regulate the banks, noted as important role of economic structure of the country. So therefore, the main point which is coming out from the court is that RBI was very much kept in the loop. Therefore, to say that it was a hurriedly taken decision which had its economic negative fallout is not completely true at all. And I think this is a very, very important point which is now coming out from the Supreme Court, which also strikes out a blow to all those who have been pushing this argument that demonetization has not had any, or it was not a well thought out economic decision.
Okay, Pallavi, if you could also tell our audiences more about the bench. Are we looking forward to two different judgments today?
They are looking at two different judgments today, but there is a bench which is now assembled here. And they are interestingly also talking about a kind of a regulation. They're also talking about the legislature or the parliament or the government in that matter can actually think of setting up a similar body to regulate the entire process. And the part but it also importantly says that the part to the center under RBI can't be restricted to certain series. So this is a very, very important point which is now being put out by Ananya, which is coming out from the Supreme Court, which clearly says that the power has been given to a center. This is under the RBI, and there cannot be restrictions applied under it.
Okay. Pallavi, if I could request, bring our audiences more context, because there has in the last few years been much controversy about what the sequence of events had been. Who had given who permission when it comes to the government and the RBI? There were also questions about whether or not the RBI's recommendations had been taken into consideration. There had been a consultation process with the RBI. We know that it began back in Feb 2016. Can you bring us that context, please?
See, what had happened essentially was that when the demonetization had taken place and we saw these long queues outside the ATMs, at that point of time, it had come in for a severe criticism, and the opposition parties had essentially said that demonetization was not very well thought out. It was an arbitrary decision, and its motive was very ulterior. And at the end of the day, it was a small businessman who had suffered and continued to suffer. People in India, for example, had argued had a tendency to save up on cash, and you did not give them much notice. Within 24 to 48 hours, they were all expected to take out their cash, and this was not acceptable and not even sensitive at all. Since then, there have been a bunch of pleas which have gone to the Supreme Court. There have been regular hearings which have taken place. Today is the day of the judgment coming in from the Supreme Court. But from the initial kind of a hearing and the judgment and the information coming out of the court which is being put out by Ananya, it becomes very clear that the Supreme Court does think that the government acted according to the guidelines. There cannot be any restrictions on the government, and those restrictions may have been, a kind of a guideline may have been put out by the RBI, but this was something which the RBI was very much kept in the loop, which means it was a well thought out economic decision. The court also goes on to say it's completely irrelevant over here whether it has its benefits or not. There was an economic reason behind demonetization, and that's the reason why government went in for it.
Okay, Pallavi, could you also tell us, if we have any information already available, I know that one of the prime accusations that Chidambaram had made in court was that he'd accused the government of withholding documents related to the decision-making process. Has the court made any comment on that yet?
Well, not yet. In fact, even as we are speaking, the hearing is coming out. But, again, another important point which is coming up from Justice Gawai is that it hasn't been hit by unreasonableness and passes the test of proportionality. So one after another, every objection which seems to have been raised by the opposition seems to have been negated. And it's very, very clear that as far as the court is concerned, it does think that it was a well thought out, needed decision by the government.
Okay. And Pallavi, a little while earlier, you were telling us that there are two separate judgments that we can expect today. Could you just break that down for our audiences? What do we mean when we're telling our audiences two separate judgments?
Well, essentially, what the Supreme Court has a couple of petitions, and the petition is one on the fact is that whether it was something which was kept in the loop, the centre took the RBI into confidence, and was a decision taken according to that. The second, of course, is on the fact that whether there has been any benefits of demonetization. Now, as of now, the Supreme Court says that it is not important to know whether the decision actually has benefited or not. But I think the court is soon going to comment on that also when it starts hearing those bunch of petitions. But for now, the first bunch of petition which is being heard by the court is clearly on the grounds of whether it was quickly taken a decision with an ulterior motive or political motive, as some from the opposition seems to be suggesting. The court initially doesn't seem to be thinking so.
Okay, Pallavi, just stay with us for a second. I'll bring our audiences more context and I'll come back to you. We'll have our legal correspondent Ananya also join us in just a few minutes from now. But just to provide you with a little bit more context, this is a 5-judge constitution bench. It was presided over by Justice S. Abdul Nazir. It's important to note here that Justice Nazir will be retiring on Jan 4th. So in just 2 days from now, this was a batch of 58 petitions that was challenging various aspects of the government's note ban decision. And remember, the Supreme Court had initially wondered if it had not become merely an academic debate because of the sheer passage of time that had passed. 2016, obviously, is when this had come to fruition. It's 2023 now. Let's go back to my colleague Pallavi to understand more in this context. Pallavi, could you tell us more about what we've watched the opposition say right from 2016? You walked us through the arguments they made in 2016 when we saw the scenes we did across the country. But could you walk us through the continued opposition we've seen over the last few years?
Well, Zoya, this has certainly been a decision which has been mired in much politics. I mean, even till today, you have political leaders like Rahul Gandhi, you have leaders like Mamata Banerjee, all of them making the point that privatization was something which has hurt the economy. If you go by Chidambaram, which is what he wrote in his petition, that he claimed that over 80% of the current.
Okay, we'll try to re-establish that connection with my colleague Pallavi. Till we do, let's visit some of the arguments that have been made. In November, so just a few days ago, the centre had actually told the Supreme Court that it began consultations with the RBI because remember the big question here is how did this decision get arrived at? What kind of consultations were made? Back in November, the centre actually told the Supreme Court that they spoke to they spoke to the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India, at least 8 months before notifying demonetization. So they said 8 months of window for those consultations was given. My colleague Pallavi is back.